Good afternoon. I'm Brett Perlman, and welcome to this week's edition of the Center for Houston's Future Leadership Webcast series. Through these conversations, we are looking to build a framework on leadership in times of crisis, looking at how leaders respond to a complex and systemic challenge such as this pandemic. We've discussed the phases of a disaster, how the framework of adaptive leadership helps us move from a response to an unfolding emergency to mitigation and recovery, and then how to use the focus and energy of a crisis to transition to new ways of thinking and behaving. Our first three speakers, Angela Blanchard, Judy Lee, and Senator Kirk Watson, helped us to examine the role of leadership and authority. And then we turned to public health experts, Dr. Eric Boerwinkle and Stephen Linder, to help us examine the transition from an emergency to recovery, and then to look at what we've learned about what we must change from the adaptive phase. And then last week, we had a really interesting discussion with a community conversation with Sandra Wegman and Robert Hausman about what we've learned so far and what's needed to move forward to the next normal. So today we're shifting our gaze to the future to consider what might change going forward. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Russell Richard, to introduce our guest and to start that conversation. Russell?
Thank you, Brett. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webcast. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Russell Richard, Vice President of Leadership and Engagement with the Center for Houston's Future. The center was established in the year 2000. This year is our 20th anniversary. The center works to convene business, government, and community stakeholders in fact-based strategic planning and collaborations on issues of the greatest importance for the future of the Houston region. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the center's leadership alumni on the webcast today. Thank you so much for your support of the center and our work. For those who'd like more information about the center or our leadership forum, please contact me or visit our website, futurehouston.org. Our next leadership forum is scheduled for September 24th of this year. The class is already half full, so please contact me soon for more information about the program and registration. Today is the 7th in our webcast series, and we're beginning to shift our focus toward the future. My guest today is Steven Pedigo with the University of Texas Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Policy. Steven is a professor and director of LBJ Urban Labs. I'm going to ask Steven to focus his attention more on the economic crisis rather than the public health crisis. As previous guests have emphasized, we can't go back to the way things were. So how do we change? How do we position the state and this region to not only survive, but thrive in very uncertain times with a very uncertain future? We will have a Q&A session at the end of our conversation, so please use your Q&A feature in your Zoom app to submit those questions during the conversation. Also, please feel free to chat with others who are on the webcast. Steven, thank you so much for joining me today. It's great to have you on the webcast.
Hey, Russell, thanks for having me, and thanks to the Center for having me here to talk to you about my work and the things that we're thinking about this pandemic and how it's impacting Texas and our cities.
Well, it's good to have you back in Texas, just in time enough to help us work through this crisis. I know you're doing good work there at UT, and we're going to use some of that as a basis for our conversation today. You have mentioned that this whole COVID situation is twofold. It's both an economic crisis as well as a public health crisis. And as we open the city and the state and the region, we're finding some reluctancy by people to venture out. What are some of the steps that we might be taking to move forward in that regard?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is great to be back in Texas. I am a Texan, even though I was joking earlier to some friends that I still have a 617 number. I lived in Boston for many years, and so a bit still trying to get my Texas roots back a bit. Look, I think that you're right. We sort of see this as obviously there are two crises that are really unfolding for us. One is this public health crisis, and then the second is sort of this economic crisis. And a good mentor to me always said, stay in your lane, know what you are good at, and talk about where you have sort of the expertise. And so most of my work has really been centered on this idea of the challenges that we're facing economically. And I think that I'm loving that we're having this conversation today, because I think that we have a short-term situation and we obviously have some long-term issues, which I know we'll talk about in a bit.
Sure.
My colleague, Rich Ford, and I, a few weeks back, issued a 10-point plan, just like everyone has 10-point plans now about things that we should be thinking about as we open up. And the thing that I would say, that's important for Texas now, particularly as we move as the governor phases out open, the phases of businesses opening up from 25% to 50% and those types of things. The thing that I keep coming back to is that in this sort of response phase, or this start of a recovery phase, we have done a lot to help businesses think about getting the financial services, the financial loans in place and things to that effect to weather the crisis. But imagine that if you were a small business owner, imagine that if you're a restaurant, imagine if you're a retail business owner, and you're now looking at a playbook that's been issued by the governor, by the lieutenant governor, and it says, here are the things that you have to do to open up your business. One of the things that I think we, as people that care about cities, that are maybe advocates for businesses, is ensuring that we not only get the sort of financial support there necessary, but the technical services. I mean, imagine that many of our businesses will need some coaching on how do you create a space that are socially distanced? How do you have to reinvent yourself to a business model that may allow you only to operate at 50% in a physical place? So one of the things I think that we can do in the short term, in addition to the financial services, is really think about those technical services. The other thing for cities, I think, is, and this has been pretty heartening to see across our state here in Austin, and Houston has done this, even in my hometown of Beaumont, Texas, has talked about the idea of how you can maybe pedestrianize your cities a little bit, right? How do you create more open public gathering spaces that are, where people can feel safe and welcome and open? How can we convert some of our parking lots, and we have lots of parking lots in Texas, into public dining facilities, right, where we can help get some small businesses open. So those are some of the ideas that I think we have to think through in the short term. This crisis allows us to have a little bit of time to experiment with some things, to see what works, what doesn't work. Maybe some of these policies stick around as we move forward, right? I mean, I live in Austin. It's great that many of our facilities are doing, maybe this is happening in Houston as well, home delivered margaritas. What's not to like about that, right? In terms of maybe that, those are things.
Sure.
Some of this gives us an opportunity to think about how we think about this going forward.
No, I appreciate that. And I think you're spot on. As we look at how we are coming out of this emergency phase into the next phase, previous guests have mentioned that we can't go back to the way things were. And in my conversation with Senator Kurt Watson, he mentioned that this next phase is more of an innovative period where we can reimagine and reinvent systems that can help us to move forward. And I know that you and Kurt Watson have done some work together recently. You just created a nice project, the Playbook for Resiliency. And would love to have you talk a little bit about that work and how some of that is applicable to where we are right now.
Sure. No, I mean, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about our work. As mentioned, I've now been back in Texas for almost a year. And so I reached out to Kirk and said, it's interesting, like you've got the governor's plan, you've got the lieutenant governor, many states and local localities in terms of regional chambers, et cetera, are thinking about how to reopen. But one of the things that struck me is that we had an opportunity to maybe reshape the way we thought about resiliency and really think about, as we look at the Texas economy, we did a lot of things. We're doing a lot of things right. Our economy is booming. We're the 10th largest in the world, the second largest in the state, adding more jobs. But there is some cracks in that and some challenges to that. And so one of the things that Senator Watson, he's now Dean Watson, as you all know, at the hobbies. Sure. I've been calling him the Deaninator. This question about what are the things that we should be thinking through and how can we reshape some principles going forward. And so in this report, which we released today, and in fact, I just got off of the interview with Texas Standard talking about this, we outline sort of 9 principles that we think that shapes a more resilient Texas. And if you have some chance to look at our report, you'll notice that in addition to these 9 principles, we outline sort of some action steps amongst each of these. But what I'd love to do is just talk a little bit about each of them.
Sure,
First
please.
one I think that is imperative is this idea of partnerships and rivalry, building partnerships. This is happening. I mean, organizations like yours, organizations like regional chamber organizations, universities are playing a role for this. But we've got to do more of this in Texas. Really build really good partnerships cross-sectorally, both the nonprofit, the foundation sector, the public and the private sector together. Because one of the things I think that will become very clear as we move through this crisis is that resources will be limited. We all need to be on the same playing field. We all need to be working from the same sheet, sort of song sheet. And so really thinking about, partnerships. And the state and the locality government did this pretty well in the response to public health. In fact, frankly, it was led by locals that then the state sort of followed. The thing what I hope, and I think, and Senator Watson would agree with this, is that as we go through this recovery period, is that really that the state doesn't sort of the state really looks to its local partnerships and organizations to build those collaboration. And so it's going to be important that we do that. It's important that the state sort of figures out some mechanisms for incentivizing that as well. The other thing, the second sort of principle of this piece is about the importance of inclusion and diversification. A lot of talk across the state about saving small businesses and main streets. I just did a webinar about main streets earlier this morning and sharing with some innovative ideas about what we could do for that. But one of the things that I think we all have learned out of this crisis is that if the 2008-2009 crisis was really about a capital crisis, many of our export sectors feeling the crunch, this has been a crisis about small business and Main Street and service-based businesses. And so this is an opportune time for us to make sure that we're building a more resilient economic base. Think about your economy as if it was a portfolio. Thinking about if it was multiple different types of sectors. You don't want to have all your eggs in one basket per se. And so, Kirk and I call for us to think about diversification, and we call for the state also to think about how we've used some of our powers and our tools, particularly incentives. This is a state that does a lot of incentive packages and a lot of tax breaks for businesses outside of the state. We're calling on the state to sort of think about how we use those tools to think about investing back into Texas businesses. How do we support Texas businesses that are expanding? How can we incentivize our private employers to build better skill-based programs? And we can do that through the same mechanisms, just redeploying some of those. So that's sort of point two. Point three is really about healthcare. There are 2 out of every 10 Texans don't have healthcare. It's access to insurance for healthcare. 5 million. It's about 5 million Texans. We are a state that turns away Medicaid dollars. And in fact, one of the things that we make in this argument in this is that that's silly. It shouldn't be a political debate. Really, it's about the idea of thinking about those dollars as economic investment dollars. You all in Houston are so lucky to have world-class healthcare. People from all over the world come to Houston and have an ecosystem that is extremely strong. Did I lose you all?
No, we're still here. I can still see you. I can still hear you.
It looked like you all went away. So healthcare makes, just continuing the continuum of healthcare is going to be really important. I think that the third point, and if you go to the next slide, is really around this idea of leading the energy future. And I know we'll come back to this and talk about this as it relates to Houston. We're all the place that.
Can we pause just for a second before we go to that next slide? I just want to remind our viewers to please submit their questions using their Q&A feature in their Zoom app, and we're going to come back to this. You're touching on a lot of great information. I don't want to lose any of these thoughts or ideas, so please continue.
The energy future. I mean, you all at Houston are the center of energy, the knowledge center for energy. One of the things that Kirk and I say in this report is that let's use that expertise. Let's think about alternative energy. That's not to say that we have to walk away from, we're not completely asking us to walk away from the production of oil and fossil fuels, but just to say, look, let's be the knowledge center. Let's lead the knowledge future. And Texas is already doing some of that. We're already seeing some of those investments and in wind energy, where we're the 5th largest wind producer in the entire world. We lead the country. There's already over 100,000 Texas jobs tied to solar. So what we're saying is, let's expand that. Let's build that into our resiliency plan, particularly as we know the world around oil has been quite volatile. Mm-hmm. The fourth point of this really is around essential workers. We've defined essential workers, more broadly in this report: service-based workers, the people that we all think that are really important, that have played a really important role in this crisis. Affordable childcare, healthcare, creating the economic message or the economic reasoning for why we want to build those safety nets in place. Healthier workers, as we know, are more economically vital and important for businesses as well. And this is something that I hope that the Texas legislature takes up this year. And as you know, my city here in Austin had some of these protections in place and were struck down by the state, but maybe this is a time where we can actually start to build in some protections for some of our service-based workers. Rural communities. I mean, Houston is, as you know, surrounded by smaller communities up and down throughout, other parts of, through other counties that really are close to you all. This is a state that prides itself on its frontier roots and its legacy of being a rural state. But as we think about investments for rural communities, we actually have to really do the investment. It can't be lip service per se, like it has been for much of us. So that's encouraging rural communities to plan like we do for metro communities. It's about making the broadband investments that we know that are still missing. It's about growing not just consumption-based communities that are all about tourism and hospitality, but that are real products and services. So really rethinking about rural communities as well. And then finally, if we go to the next slide, we'll grab the quick three and hopefully get this in a quick conversation. Skill investment. We know economic development 101, 21st century economic development is about investment in skills, not people, not cheap labor. So investing in skills. It's about using our universities as places that can leverage their power, not just as great R&D facilities, but facilities that can really direct economic development. That's local purchasing, that's local hiring, that's serving as community hubs. And then finally, the debate around infrastructure. And I know with the question around I-45 and are we widening? Are we thinking about public transportation? Those types of things, the bullet train between Dallas and Houston, investing in an infrastructure that's really going to allow metropolitan Texas to grow. At the end of the day, rural communities are important to Texas and our legacy. And there's a lot of folks that still live in those smaller communities. But Texas is a metro state. It is a state where 9 in 10 of us live in metros. Almost 80% of the GDP is demonstrated out of the Texas Triangle. If you look at startup investment and capital, nearly 99% of all startup that VC dollars that Texas have are all in these metro communities, and so we need the infrastructure that can support the growth of our urban communities as well. So those are the nine principles. I encourage you to take a look at the report. I don't think a lot of it some of it will be new. Some of it maybe is just about reframing some issues that have been in our agenda for a while, but really through a lens that we hope makes an economic argument that can convince some of our state leaders and our policy leaders and our legislature to maybe move on some of these ideas.
Well, thank you for taking us through that, Steven. I really appreciate it. I think your 9 key principles are very impressive. You're no stranger to Texas. You're familiar that the Texas Gulf Coast has endured a number of storms and natural disasters, and we've looked at essential workers. We've looked at rural communities. Just how optimistic are you that we'll be able to build those relationships between state and local when the relationship between the two have been so adversarial over the past? And when we talk about rural communities, and we look at how COVID has impacted some of the rural communities and communities that have suffered the most, how optimistic are you that we could actually develop something in the short term that will have some impact on those communities?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a lot of pieces to unpack there. So I guess by nature, I'm an optimistic person, right? I
Sure.
mean, people meet me, I tend to be an optimistic a cheerleader. I think sometimes so that when you do the work that we do, it's about economic development and city building, you sort of have to be optimistic about the work. Let's take the point of resiliency first. I think your point about Hurricane Harvey and the implications of that is something that's really real to me. My parents were affected by that. I grew up in Beaumont. My parents had 27 inches of water in their house. So I understand resiliency and sort of what that looks like in terms of how it hits us at home. I think one of the things that we have to do to ensure future resiliency is obviously think about the environmental pieces of this, but what we call for in this report is that economic resiliency. And the reason that we think that economic resiliency has to be a part of the larger conversation is because of exactly the things that you've outlined about earlier. And that is, well, what's the impact on smaller communities? What's the impact on our rural communities? What's the impact on the underserved? If we can build more resilient communities, if we can build more resilient economies, what we know is the impacts and shocks of natural disasters, of things like a pandemic, like a public health crisis. What we know is the impact for those tend to be a little bit shorter lived than if we're not thinking about resiliency, right? If we're not putting all of our eggs in our basket. I think that the challenge, as you mentioned here, is about getting that cooperation, and it's going to require organizations like the Center for the Future, my organization at UT Austin, others, chamber organizations, to continue to communicate the point that we are a metro state, that we are an urban state, that we are a state that is seeing extreme growth. And the thing that I would suggest is that if we don't learn how to manage that growth, the growth will manage us. And so that's going to, by definition, require our state legislature and our public officials to really figure out a way to work together in a way that can be more, frankly, inclusive of different ideas. As we write in the report, local communities have that great knowledge about what's on the ground, but the state has a valuable point as well about bringing a perspective that is about how policies and implications affect very different types of metropolitan areas across our community, or very different types of communities across our state. So I think that both play a really important role, but man, it does take leadership, and it takes leadership just at the city level, but also leadership at the state level to figure out how do you collaborate together, as you know.
Sure. Well, this whole webcast series has been, in essence, about leadership, and we've had the opportunity to talk with some remarkable leaders, including yourself. You mentioned something earlier in your comments about Main Street and small businesses being the heart and soul of the city. And when we look at Houston, the Houston region, our food culture, our walkable neighborhoods, our green spaces are very important and play a very key role in this being a livable and desirable city. How, given everything that's happening right now, how do we nurture that? How do we keep that and move that forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really important piece of the question. I mean, one of the things that we've written a lot about is the idea that our main streets, as you suggested, and our food culture is the soul of why we live in cities. And it's important I think it's important to sort of step back and talk about why they matter, and then how do we save them? When you look across the country, there are about 20 million Americans that work for what we would classify as Main Street businesses. Those are restaurants, retail, those types of things. And so from an employment standpoint, significant employment standpoint. But they also, as you mentioned, Russell, are, and hint at this in your question, a really important part of our front porch, our economic development story, to how we communicate who we are as cities and places to individuals. In fact, a lot of the work that my colleagues and team at a group called Residents have looked to say, look, if you want to have export sectors, if you want to have FDI, if you want to do all those things that we talk about that drive economies, it's important to have vibrant main streets, because those become amenities that attract. My colleague Rich Florida wrote a lot about the importance of quality of place. So how do we do that? I think that we have to think, obviously, and we're suggesting, like a lot of folks, think about this in 3 phases. the idea of immediate assistance, the idea of what we're calling this reboot, and that is the question of how we can help our businesses establish, practices and innovative models, how we as EDOs can play an important role. Maybe it's from, creating local purchasing agreements for cleaning supplies, to technology platforms, to how we communicate a message. So the final piece of this, that we may actually have to even reimagine what some of our main streets look like. And that may require us to reimagine density around those organizations. In Austin, this is a big conversation around, for instance, here around our land use planning. In fact, one of the things we know is that increased density in some of our commercial corridors may actually help lower commercial real estate costs for some of our small businesses. So that could play an important role. We may have to think about community retail, restaurants as community resources. Like so many of us live in communities where maybe we pay for access to a park or a swimming pool or a fitness facility. Maybe there's a model here where we have to reimagine that some of these smaller businesses may have to be maybe community assets. And then finally, really reinvesting in our commercial corridors. And that's the, Bruce Katz, who was for a long time led the Metropolitan Group at Brookings. He's now at Drexel University. Has been writing a lot about this idea that, for so long, cities really invested back in the CBD, into the downtown Houston area or the downtown Austin area or the downtown Dallas corridor, because of the return back to the downtown. What we may actually need to do going forward to ensure that we're saving Main Street is ensure that we're providing place investments in some of our neighborhoods that have not seen that. So this may be a time for us to really have place-based economics play a really important role in how we recover from this challenge.
Well, thank you. Again, I want to remind our viewers to please submit your questions. Steven, I really appreciate all of your insight and your ideas. When we talk about what we keep and what goes away, in every conversation in this webcast series, we've talked about that we can't go back to the way things were, and some things are going to disappear. Who gets to decide that? Is that decided by our government leaders? Is that decided by the community? How do we build consensus around what stays and what's eliminated? Or is that too big of a hill to climb?
Right. I think that a lot of these, I think it's a shared conversation about what happens and what sticks. I think that now we're absolutely at a time where, we're going to look to the question of what are these lasting impacts of this pandemic? What are the lasting policy changes of the pandemic? What will play a role? And so, a lot of this will be done by voting of feet, right? Consumers will make a decision about what products and services stick around. Policy leaders are going to have to look to see what is the impact that certain policies have had on the way that the businesses operates and how that has resonated with communities. Business leaders are going to ask the question, is this a sustainable business model going forward? Look, I don't think that, I hope that this time next year, we're not talking via video screens. That I hope that we are still coming together. We know, right, that the drivers of development, the drivers of economics, what makes thriving cities is people like you and I coming in together to share ideas, to have a coffee, to really, in a sense, collide, right? That's in a critical point of city living. Now, we may have to do that differently. And some changes may stick, right? The idea that we may have a little bit more flexibility around remote work, I hope that sticks. The idea that we have now finally, as a collective community, thought about the importance of essential-based workers, I hope that sticks. So there are certain things that will stick and not. I think it's a collective conversation. And, we in Texas are all of us across the country are lucky, but in Texas, we are going to go to the polls in November. And we're going to vote for a new legislature. And so it is a time to also think about how we hold some of our public officials competitive. Go to those, your town hall meetings with your local state reps and state senators and ask these questions. Ensure that they are pushing and thinking about resiliency going forward. It is time now. We can't go back. We can't go back to the old growth model. The old growth model is broken.
Right.
It's not going to work. We're going to need forward
Right.
leaders, and we as centered, business representatives and community members can push people to do that.
Sure, sure. Steven, thank you. You've been so generous with your time. I want to pivot a little bit and take some of the questions that are coming from our viewing audience.
Right.
And my first question to you is, which I think is a very good one. I think that moving forward, our decisions need to be fact-based. But how can we make decisions fact-based when the knowledge and the information is so rapidly changing?
That is such a really, really good question. I mean, it's funny because I was doing this great report 2 weeks ago. I was doing this data report, and I was actually working in a collaboration with Texas Monthly. We were going to do a state of Texas report. All the data was done. Then COVID happens. And then, the conversation with the editors is like, this is irrelevant now, right? A lot of what was coming out of this was irrelevant. Tell that to a group of university researchers who've been working on it for a few months, right?
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I think there are lots of things that we have to do. Like, one is, it would be great, and I think we call for this in the report, to have some near-term and data dashboards that cities and local leaders and state officials could subscribe to and agree to in collection of data. I think that's one thing we can do. I think that the other sort of central piece of this is surveys of data. From a survey, as a social scientist, I sort of think about social survey data being really, really critical as in terms of information. But also, like, it is also good to go back and look at to use some of that older data and that older research to also guide conversations. As I was saying to some of to some client type contacts that I'm doing the regional plan in Portland, Oregon right now. We were having this conversation earlier in the week, is that a lot of the principles and a lot of the things that we still care about, pre-pandemic, are still going to be some of the same principles that we care about in the post-pandemic world. And so continuing to measure those, and while we may see that spike, that over time, that dip or that spike over time, it's important to keep measuring those data points to ensure that we're making some progress over time. And so I think, you want a short-term dashboard and a real-time data dashboard, but also being in the sense of realizing that you can't be paralyzed by data as well. A lot of times I think as city officials, as people who think about development, sometimes we get inundated with too much research or too much data, and we use that to not really guide conversations. And so quantitative data is great, but man, focus groups, roundtable discussions, doing things like this, these are all the types of things that I'm encouraging my clients to do. I'm encouraging, get out and talk to your businesses, get out and talk to your representatives and stuff, and start to see what all of those data points can sort of shape you in a way that can get you there.
Right. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. In the very opening of our conversation, I mentioned that I really wanted to focus in on the economic crisis, but we're getting some questions that kind of deal with public health as well. In addition to accepting Medicare dollars, how can we think about paying for or expanding healthcare coverage? You have any ideas or thoughts on that?
It's a great it's a great question. So I think, one of the things that we found, right, in looking at the expanding of Medicare dollars is that for every dollar that you accept, there's a multiplier effect, right? And so one of the things is not to really sort of to sort of say that that's not going to play an important role. That's absolutely going to be a key piece to this. The other thing I think is that for too long we have thought about healthcare we haven't thought about healthcare as a potential for economic development. And so one of the things that we say in this report is a way to pay for healthcare investments is to think about healthcare as a driver for economic development, as an investment in a community. And so that's one way to think about that, right? And in fact, it is about taking advantage of all of the large investments that have been made in this state, particularly around critical care, around life sciences, and not around sort of the continuum of care, and sort of thinking about how we can think about that in a larger economic development piece. The other thing that I would suggest in terms of the investments of healthcare around economic, particularly healthcare, is that healthcare can be, for many of our smaller communities, particularly our rural communities, can be community-based anchors. That if we are investing in the right types of community investments around healthcare, they can be job accelerators. They can be community accelerators. And in fact, there have been many places across the U.S. and frankly across the world that you can look at that have built what we call meds and eds economies, servicing local residents with very good healthcare and educational resources. And so, thinking about it as an economic development driver is one critical role. You know, the other thing is that this is a state that just maybe at some point will have to make those types of investments, right? I mean, there are choices that have to be made at times. And this is a choice that, to me, given the rise of a pandemic, given the fact that we know that public health is economic development, right? Public health now is economic development, or economic development is public health. We should be making those same types of investments that we would have done in companies or enterprises that are voted to the state in the types of businesses or enterprises. Maybe it's more private, maybe it is, that does those provides those types of services for our local residents and for our neighbors, frankly.
Well, you mentioned rural communities in your remarks there, and we're all working, or most of us are working remotely these days. Is there any opportunity to grow rural communities by enhancing how we are working remotely or working from home? Any thoughts? I think at this point we're just going to have to start thinking out of the box here and really imagine things differently. What are your thoughts about how we grow rural communities?
Yeah, look, so the practice around rural development, right? I mean, so you have to kind of take a step back, right? The practice around rural development across the entire United States or the research around rural development, I think, is we don't really have the great toolkit by which we do for urban economies, right? Urban economies are driven by, or metropolitan economies are driven by the idea that you and I and our like firms come together, we build those ecosystems, we build those enterprise systems, and those allow us to grow. In rural communities, we don't have that density, right? We don't have that. And in fact, as you look across the US, most of the development in rural communities are the rural communities that have been able to develop have been around sort of three things. One, either you, by the glory of the grace of God, have a large anchor-based institution like a Walmart that is invested in your region, likely, but unfortunately most places don't have that. Two, hospitality, tourism, and three is sort of this recreation piece. Well, the two, hospitality and recreation, what we know is that in this environment, that those are the types of industries and the types of places that may see the greatest impact for this in the long term. And so, while places like where I grew up and smaller rural communities are thinking, well, this pandemic is not really had an impact, my message to a lot of those leaders is that it is coming, that the implications, particularly the economic tidal wave, is coming, and we have to be able to think forward. So how can we do that? First, I think is one of the things that, and IC Squared is an institute at UT Austin, which for a long time has invested in entrepreneurship in urban communities, has really brought some of its thinking to rural places. And the great Art Markman, who leads that organization, said a long time ago that one of the reasons, if we really want to drive rural communities, we've got to get rural communities to create a sense of scale. So we've got to require that they plan together. We've got to incentivize that they plan together. We've got to give them the capabilities to do that. And so that's the expertise around that. So planning together. Two, we have to think about the idea of how we build export economies, right? They can't be places of just local consumption. They can't continue to be just driven by hospitality and tourism. And so we have to take a deeper dive in looking at, are there urban economy assets that we could spread some of the supply chain here in Texas? We may see more supply chain going back domestically. Is that an opportunity for rural Texas if there's the capabilities there and the thought given to that? Possible. And then the final point that you mentioned, which I think is an interesting one, is remote work. Remote work is possible. The great thing about a lot of smaller communities across Texas, they have great schools. They've invested in quality of place. They position themselves in terms of wellness. And we may see people wanting to pull away from urban centers, right? The push and pull of this effect. But that requires an investment in a digital infrastructure. That requires us to think about how we as a state can do that. And we've done some of that, but there's a lot more needed in terms of the digital divide. And we can see the digital divide even happening in urban communities like Houston and Dallas and here in Austin. So that infrastructure has to be there. But the other thing is that we also, not only do we want to think about planning together, do we want to think about export economies and think about the infrastructure in place. One of the things that if you're going to go down the rural community piece is that we have to think about how we help those remote workers build community. Community is an important piece. And so you've got to create that ecosystem just as if you would in an urban economy. Tulsa, Oklahoma has done some of this with their remote work program through the Kaiser Foundation. Now, the Kaiser Foundation was giving $10,000 grants for people to move to Tulsa to spur a rebirth of talent in the Tulsa area. And it's actually, quite frankly, amazingly worked really well. I think last year they had over 80,000 applications for their cohort of about 200 remote workers. The money thing's interesting, but what was more interesting to me from a best practices standpoint was about how they were really intentional about creating community. And so that's the other thing, is that if rural communities want to take advantage of remote work, we've got to be really intentional about social capital building and social cohesion building, because we know that's what makes people sticky long-term in communities.
Well, before we entered this pandemic, there was a lot of discussion about immigration, in particular here in Texas. And the economic growth in Texas historically has relied upon immigration for low-skilled work and also high-skilled work. Is that likely to change in your opinion? And how do we continue to value and protect our immigrant community?
I'm glad that you said not just low-skilled, but you said high-skilled work, right? Because I think that's an important point. When we talk about immigrant labor and we talk about immigrant skills, the biases a lot of times in the public conversation is around low-skilled work. But what we know is that immigrants, particularly in our state and places like California, have been really, really important at the high-skilled level as well. New enterprise, new businesses, being entrepreneurial. I think this continues. I think that immigration will continue to play a really important role here. It may slow over time, but I think that if we are thinking about immigration, particularly on the low-skilled level, I think we want to make sure that we're doing all the things that we've talked about ensuring essential workers actually get some protections in place that are necessary. On the on the entrepreneur and high school level, I spent many years at ICIC, which is a think tank thinking about underserved entrepreneurs. Ensuring that many of our immigrants, even though they've got high skills, get the technical services to create those businesses, and we celebrate the creation of those businesses and the creation and the contributions to those residents make to our community. Really important principles of development as well. But Texas is a place that will continue to grow. And it's going to continue to grow because of a lot of Texans that have lived here for generations, but also because a new generation of new Texans. And so I think we want to embrace immigration and think about how it is a really, really critical ingredient that makes communities go work. In fact, my mentor, Rich Florida, wrote The Rise of the Creative Class, probably the book that shaped urban development the most since Jane Jacobs. And the key central part of that argument is that what makes places thrive is the mixing and mingling of different people, different ideas, and immigration plays a huge, huge important role in that.
I mentioned earlier that, part of Houston's culture is, our affinity for our food and our restaurants. And as we've reopened the city, we reopened the state, some of the restaurants are indeed reopening, but not at full capacity. And I'm concerned that they can continue to operate that way. What are some of your ideas and thoughts about how we might be able to, to save some of the restaurants that we've really come to enjoy and love? Because I'm concerned that if we continue down this course for the next month or two, they may not survive.
Yeah, again, you're right. This is the question. There's so many levers that we could pull, right? There is there's the policy lever of can we make it easier to do delivery service or, different types of products and services? Is it about ensuring that they get the financial assistance out of the bank? We know that a lot of immigrant businesses, for instance, can't get traditional lines of credit. They depend on local community funding, community bank funding, for instance. So ensuring that those financial resources are there. It is. I think it's about. I think it comes back to a lot of this about just ensuring that we're coaching. Again, I don't mean to oversimplify, but technical. The question around or the support around small businesses from the financial piece was a really important point. But the point that I've been selling to a lot of city officials is that you can make all those investments that you want, but unless you're helping folks reimagine their business planning models, helping them think about how they get access to the technology that allows you and I to grab the delivery or the takeout or of that, or even communicating a message, helping them communicate a message, right, about wellness and safety, that those businesses and potentially could be dead in the water. And so it's not just about, it's about policies, it's about financial, it's about the education. And then I think it's a lot of it will require cities, communities, organizations like yours, chambers, to really communicate a message, right? We've got to communicate a message around health and, we obviously got to practice the health and wellness now.
Sure.
We've got to communicate and convince people that we are actually doing it.
Right.
And so that's going to be a really, really key piece of this as well.
Right. Well, as you know, Houston is the energy capital of the world. And during this crisis, that industry has really taken a big hit. What is your ideas about how regional leaders can, and I guess federal leaders can address what's happening in our oil and gas industry and perhaps create, new clean energy jobs?
Yeah, so first of all, it's about embracing that that alternative energy and new energy is the wave of the future, right? And not sort of just writing it off that it's nice to have, right? It's a nice to have, but not a need to have. For the state of Texas, alternative energy and being the center for alternative energy and the thought leadership around that is a need to have, right? That's number one. Two, it is about ensuring that we are, maybe there is the creation of and this is quite forward thinking, a lot of states have renewable energy goals. Why not at the state level are we not thinking about renewable, aggressive alternative energy goals that can allow us to really drive consumption in a place that can change this? It's about investing in using the power of our toolkit, our incentive dollars, our tax breaks, our business climate to attract those types of companies. Look, if Tesla's not happy in California because they can't open up their plant for lots of different political reasons, well, that'd be a great addition to the Energy Production Center and the sort of battery development group here in Texas. So again, communicating that we're open for business and using that is another piece to this. And finally, thinking about, just as we think about healthcare along the continuum, one of the things that I would encourage local leaders and city officials to think about is think about the idea of alternative energy across a continuum. It's not just the research and the R&D. It's not just the people that are putting together solar panels or building wind farms or shipping it. It's also it's also the continuum of skills that come along that if we could get mass solar adoption across commercial and residential space, the people that install them, right? The installators, the commercial, the technicians that come along with that. And so thinking about the continuing of skills, because those are going to create the on-ramps. A lot of workers that are in the oil patches of Midland and Odessa and other places across the state right now are really feeling the pinch. Not to say that they have to transition completely around this, but let's start training these people now, making those investments now. So it's about, I think for a state like Texas, we are the energy capital of the world, but it's about taking alternative energy serious and not just about alternative energy is important for us for lots of climate goals. And in fact, if you talk to all of my students at the University of Texas, the number one issue they care about and the way they're making place decisions. But it's also thinking about this as an economic driver, and it has the opportunity to be an economic driver if done right.
Well, it seems that the Center for Houston's Future and LBJ Urban Labs and the Hobby School at the University of Houston have a lot in common. Should we be leading and organizing some of these discussions and collaborations on how we build consensus?
Absolutely. It's the reason that Kurt and I wrote the piece together, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that for too long, universities have acted in their, have been active in silos. We make the case in the report that universities are great R&D and research centers, but if you look at the practices of university engagement, for instance, across the state of Texas, we're pretty slow. There's an advanced practice of anchor collaboratives and anchor developments. When I say anchor, university, healthcare institutions, those types of things playing a role. We here in Texas have not really have done a lot of that. And so, how can we think about the University of Houston system? How can we think about the University of Texas system, which is one of the largest in the world, second most endowed in the entire world behind Harvard? How can we use a system like that to really drive and catalyze community development? So it's about new partnerships like that what we did with the Hobby School. In fact, we're doing a partnership with the Kinder Institute at Rice about a metropolitan agenda for the fall, which I'm really excited about. But it's also saying that, look, we can't just be centers of knowledge and idea. We got to get our faculty and our students to engage with community and be real drivers of community development. That's a shift for Texas, and that will take some time to get there, I think.
Well, Steven, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. We've really enjoyed hearing your insights and your ideas. I want to also thank our viewing audience for tuning in with us again this week. Please be on the lookout for information about our next webcast, which will happen on next Wednesday, May the 20th. We'll have Scott McClellan, the president of HEB, and the director, Asaph Benton. Dr. Asaph Benton, who's a nationally recognized healthcare innovation expert and executive director at the Arenado Labs, which is a Harvard affiliate health innovation center. It's been great being with you guys today. I'm Russell Richard. Good day, stay safe, and be well.
Thanks, Russell. Thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation.
It's been fun. Thank you.